Hello everyone and welcome to another geography brain revision session. So I'm going to start off today with evaluate the responses to a UK weather hazard that you have studied. So again, this is a classic type of 9-mark question, and as a lot of the 9 markers are often asking us to do, they're asking to be evaluative, whether they come up with something like being assess the extent or those kind of starters to the questions. So first of all, let's just bug the questions. So let's just underline our keyword there that it's asking us to do. So it's asking us to evaluate. Let's just also underline responses, so we know that we need to direct our thought towards the responses of a weather hazard that we've studied, and specifically a UK weather hazard. Okay, and the UK weather hazard that you guys studied was the Somerset Levels floods, which happened in 2010. So if I just pop that there. And I'll just put it in brackets. 2010. There we go. Okay, the best way I think to evaluate responses is to think in the immediate and think in the long term. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to put it out as immediate, and then I'm going to go long term here. Okie doke. So let's have a think back to the immediate responses to the UK weather hazards. Well, the Somerset Levels, sorry. Well, one of the big things that happened was some local community support and volunteer work. That was one of the main ways in which people could help out with one another. So I'm going to write that down. Local community or volunteer help. Okay, that was a big start. The next thing that also happened is that the army were eventually sent in to try and help as well. Sent in, and a lot of what the army tried to do is save people from their flooded houses, but a huge proportion of it was actually providing food and, most importantly, clean drinking water. Remember, we're being asked to evaluate here, and what I always think is useful if we are evaluating is just to put a little bar across like that. 0 on that side, 10 on that side, but we'll come back to that in a second. Okay, long-term effects. Now, these are really interesting, and David Cameron, the Prime Minister at the time, helped set up something which was called the Flood Action Plan. Okay, so it's the Flood Action Plan. And this was to the tune of £20 million. So there's a big amount of investment. There was a few different things that occurred from that £20 million. There was a period of dredging of some of the local rivers, and what that essentially means is where we get some big diggers that essentially go and drag out some of the mud and that's basically deposited at the bottom of a river, and it allows a much larger volume of water to be able to go down into, eventually reaching kind of estuaries or the mouth of river where it goes into the sea. Other things that this flood action plan did was eventually started looking at raising roads, so put roads raised in the local area, so that essentially these communities which were once like isolated by these floods would now at least be able to communicate with one another and allow cars to pass over these areas just in case the floods happened again. Another thing that happened was that the riverbanks were raised. Okay, so that if we just draw a quick kind of cross section, so here's our kind of riverbank, something kind of looks a bit like that, and so we've got our river here. If we deposit lots of material here, then it means that we have to have larger amounts of floods to be able to reach over the top there. So a very effective way of protecting the local area. And finally, in a very, very long term as well, there's some potential for possible tidal barrier to better control the influx and outflow of water a lot into these southern areas. Now, we can go through that quite quickly, I think, but this is quite a difficult one to evaluate because ultimately the immediate responses were pretty good. I think it was only 2 people died as a direct consequence. I'd have to check that fact out. But the immediate responses were quite good. Okay, so I'm going to give it somewhere about an 8. However, it's an interesting one because also I think the long-term responses were very effective. However, we haven't seen, or we haven't quite had the highest levels of floods that we saw in 2010. So maybe these haven't been quite tested yet. But ultimately, I think a £20 million action plan is pretty effective and a pretty big step in the right direction for protecting this area against this UK weather hazard. So I'm going to go with 9, but some of you might not agree. Okay, how are we going to just bring that all together then? So in my opinion, I think that the long-term responses have been more effective than the immediate responses when we're looking at a UK weather hazard. However, overall, I feel that the responses to this hazard were actually particularly effective. We had limited lives lost. We had limited effects on the economy on a large scale. We also had some really important long-term responses as well, which will make a big impact on that environment, okay? But I think they're very close in terms of long-term or immediate responses. However, I think they were ultimately quite effective. How you go about answering that is something we'll start to look at as well in the future. Okay, thank you very much. And as per usual, if you have any questions for me, just come and find me in A181.